It's that time of year where we gear up for some of the spookiest, scariest, most terrifying films and activities of all time. But as cool as some of these movies and properties are, some of the most terrifying and genuinely horrific stuff lurks in the dark and dusty corners of human history. Hello everybody, my name is Kyle and you're watching Desks and Dorks. We talk about tabletop role-playing indie games and we usually bring a nice historical bent to it. A couple of things, if you really like what we do here, our Patreon, $10 a month, gets you your own unique role-playing game that you cannot get anywhere else. If you would like to get physical copies of Desks and Dorks games, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf or Indie Press Revolution. And if you like digital copies of our games, why not get them over at itch.io? So what are we going to be doing today? I want to look at some of the strange, the weird, and the bizarre parts of history. The nitty-gritty stuff, the things that people leave out because they're usually too stomach-churning or potentially just really kind of creepy and scary, or maybe stuff that you just don't particularly know about. There are some interesting things that I think get left out in those cobweb-filled corners of history, and it's kind of perfect for Halloween. What kind of horror game you could run in relation to that setting or that particular topic. Again, some tips on how I would potentially implement such horrific things. And lastly, I'm actually going to end with some of my favorite horror role-playing games that I think are totally worth a little bit of a try. With that out of the way, let's talk about safety and communication tools. If you're going to be engaging in some of the most horrific parts of human history, and I do particularly love doing that in some of my games, I play with a lot of actors and comedians, people who really take that stuff to heart. I love doing it, but if you're going to do that, just make sure you're using safety and communication tools, have an ongoing dialogue with your players, try to make sure everyone feels comfortable at your table. I think it's really important, particularly if you're getting into the kind of nitty-gritty. Also, I really liked this particular system. I mentioned I play with a lot of actors, and I love the idea of an Involve Me card, because sometimes someone is like literally acting their heart out, and you're like, I want to jump in with a character moment or something that I think would add to that scene, and I think it's really cool to have access to that so that like a player or a GM knows, hey, someone wants to kind of jump in with you. I think that's really cool. I might actually try that one in some of my games, but I thought this would be a particularly interesting and useful resource for you. But with that established, let's have a conversation about a civilization that was no stranger to horrific violence and battlefield atrocity, that being the Romans. And as amazing, and by amazing I mean horrific, as those atrocities are, in many ways they pale to the kind of infinite horrors and intimate horrors of the Coliseum. You might look at the Coliseum and see a building carved from marble, but if you study its history and the lives of the people impacted by that building, it is a charnel house for honest-to-God horror. And again, the massive scope perhaps belies how deeply personal and intimate some of that horror was. But we have to start with the spectacle, right? That's kind of Rome's shtick, isn't it? And if you've watched Gladiator 2, that's okay, let's be real here for a second, it's not amazing, but it's okay, then you might have seen where they flood the Coliseum and have an honest-to-gosh naval battle in there. And if anything, the scene in Gladiator 2 is underselling how savage, how vast, and how violent this spectacle truly was. Imagine it for a moment. You are a captive brought in to fight on one of those galleys, because for these massive historical reenactments, because they required so many people, not all of them were trained gladiators who could expect a little bit of leniency because they were investments on the part of their leaders in the ludus. No, if you're doing one of these historical reenactments, chances are you were a conscripted prisoner, a person taken from some of the outlying provinces, or somebody who had the grave misfortune of being brought back to Rome alive. You would be shoved into a dark pit into the ground, eventually brought up, shackled to a, ship. In many cases, the people rowing those were shackled, and then all of a sudden it just takes a little bit of splintering wood, the sound of combat, and before you know it, you are now drowning in the middle of this strange arena while thousands of people cheer on your demise. In many ways, the spectacle horror of the Coliseum is a wonderful little microcosm of just kind of how terrible a group of people can be when they allow a lust for entertainment and a callous disregard for their fellow man sort of inform how much they want to be entertained and distracted. And it doesn't get a whole lot better if you're somebody of, say, I don't know, political prisoner sort of bent, if you're a religious dissident of some kind, or if the emperor just wants to make an example out of you. Public executions in the Coliseum were in fact pretty common, and usually this is where Christian revisionism comes in. Usually the Christians kind of hype up how bad things are for a lot of different groups. If anything, the stories about Christian executions at the hands of emperors like Nero and Caligula is kind of underselling it. It's really bad. And it's not just the Christians, by the way. They do not own carte blanche when it comes to being destroyed in horrific ways for the entertainment of the masses. Political prisoners, individuals who managed to tick off the emperor, as I mentioned, also enjoyed a fate worse than death, in some cases being maimed and mauled over a period of hours, and in some cases they would just sort of crucify you in the Coliseum and then watch you slowly die. And it's at this part that I actually want to explain to you why crucifixion was a popular form of execution in the Roman Empire, not just in the Colosseum, but in general. You might, if you are, in the West, sort of been trained by the idea of a Christian crucifixion. You might look at the nails in the hands and the dripping blood of Renaissance painters and assume that that's actually what takes you out. No, in fact, crucifixion is a slow, agonizing end by suffocation. When you read the New Testament and that Roman soldier drives the spear into Jesus' side, that is essentially what would be done to try to put the person out of their misery. Another common way of doing this was to break the person's legs or knees to finally allow the pectoral muscles to fall, and they would just stop breathing. Essentially what happens in crucifixion is you are struggling to hold your body up long enough to catch a breath until exhaustion, or again, the aforementioned leg/knee breaking, finally stops you from being able to do that, and you literally asphyxiate on the cross. This was an agonizing process that took hours upon hours to be complete, depending on the will of the person undergoing the torment, and that made it ideal, quote unquote, for public spectacle. I wanted to throw this in. This was not in the original script, by the way, because I think it goes a long way to showing how something like the Colosseum, which has been hyped up in popular culture, is in many ways one of the most horrific examples of what mankind is truly capable of. And it doesn't get much better even if you are a trained gladiator. One of the most popular, and we know this from first-hand accounts of the gladiatorial fights in the arena, one of the most popular events is a 1v2 or sometimes like 2v4 style of gladiatorial combat, where the more gladiator side would be given less armor and worse weapons and had to sort of work together, but they were greatly, obviously, outnumbered their opponents. The opponents would be given phenomenal weapons and armor, but usually a helmet or some sort of thing that would limit their senses. This essentially traps them in almost a metal sarcophagus as they're being surrounded by people, and the people who are surrounding them are also kind of undergoing that horror because they don't have any protection. One errant swing, one wrong move, and you're going to be, you're going to meet your end on the sand floor of the Coliseum. That doesn't even take into account gladiators like the Bistarii, who are gladiators who would essentially fight against wild animals, and as part of the quote-unquote fun for those events, because they were not up against a human opponent, and because they were the lowest class of gladiator, usually composed of freed slaves or former slaves, and those taken as prisoners in war or just prisoners in general for regular crimes, they weren't properly equipped. You were lucky if you got a club or a spear to help you go toe-to-toe with a bear, a leopard, an auroch, or any number of wild, exotic, and frankly speaking, angry animals fighting for their lives that had been taken from anywhere in the empire. We have first-hand accounts of the Bistarii not exactly doing super well. There are a few who do okay, but for the most part, It's literally like grabbing a toothpick and trying to fight a hurricane full of teeth. Doesn't exactly go very well, especially because many of the Beastarii were not trained warriors. They were people who committed crimes or were captured and forced to fight against an animal they had really no hope of beating and no business fighting against. And I think one of the most horrific parts of this whole thing is the intimate horror of the Coliseum. One thing that fails to be brought into account, at least in early depictions of the gladiatorial arenas, but I think it's starting to come into light more, is the idea of the patronage. The patricians loved the gladiators. In many cases, they were rock stars, right? Now, rock stars undergoing a constant PTSD causing horror, sure, but rock stars all the same. And like groupies, many times patricians would, how do I put this gently without YouTube demonetizing everything in this video, would ply their favorite gladiators for carnal services. And in some cases, if you did not render those carnal services to the patrician, they could try to have things rigged to take you out, which means that you are literally stuck between potentially losing your life and being physically and emotionally exploited by someone far more powerful than you. This is the kind of intimate horror I was alluding to earlier, but in my mind, the idea of having to give up those pieces of yourself just to survive is part of what makes the horror of the Coliseum something that I think is so immediately grabbing, yes, but ultimately something that is immensely human. And I think that goes a long way to showing that for all of the folks who enjoyed the luxury of the Coliseum, there were many more who were desperately clinging to life every single day. Now, what kind of game do I think would go well in a Coliseum? And I truthfully think the Monster of the Week is a perfect system for this. Again, you're at your discretion how much you want to lean into the horror aspect of it, as I have laid it out, the very real, very horrific side of the Roman Colosseum, or the sort of pulp adventure aspects that would be common in something like Ben-Hur, or an admittedly ahistorical movie but a total banger, Gladiator. Now, you could theoretically have your heroes be beginning gladiators. They could essentially start from the ground up. They could have classes. This is one of the few systems I think that a class-based system and equipment would work well in, because we know the different types of gladiator that fought. Fun fact, by the way, gladiators like the Samnite are based on some of the original tribes and city-states that Rome destroyed. Just kind of interesting. But again, the tactics are different for these gladiators. The gear is different. The training is different. It lends itself nicely to a class-based system. And every week, they could be up against some sort of new, horrific, or terrifying opponent, be it a monsters brought in from strange new places across a fantasy world, to other gladiators, and it also offers the opportunity for amazing set piece like encounters like the ones that we talked about earlier, with them flooding the Coliseum to recreate historical naval battles or things of that ilk. It's really easy to do a Monster of the Week style of game because every week, or in this case every event, could be a different battle, a different puzzle for your players to solve, and a different horror for them to withstand. It gets even worse, or quote-unquote maybe better, more engaging is perhaps the term I'm looking for, when you lean into the political and religious importance and the political and religious intrigue that the Colosseum was constantly surrounded by, as a result of it being an important nexus both for the patricians and the ruling class of Rome, as well as its populace. I think all of those things make the Colosseum a wonderful place for historical horror. And again, ultimately one that I think does not be considered as a horror house nearly as much as it should be. And another thing too, you don't even need to set it in the main Colosseum in Rome. It was entirely common throughout the empire for other smaller cities or outposts to have smaller coliseums. I've included a admittedly blurry picture of the ones here, but these are all examples of Roman coliseums scattered throughout the remnants of its former empire. And I think that's really interesting because it means that you could have, if a character perishes in the line of duty, you could bring in another character. If a character gets unalived by some giant monster, you could bring them in from another different arena. It's perfect for a system kind of like DCC, where there's already the knowledge, I almost said the knowing of the funnel, where you're going to be churning through characters anyway. Why not give yourself the world building out that these characters in the funnel aren't just randomly appearing, they're coming in from arenas around the country and being funneled into the main arena, which is where your adventure might take place. There's a lot of good stuff there with the Coliseum for a system like this, and ultimately too, with as much horrific violence and terror that the Coliseum has, it's a wonderful place for something like Call of Cthulhu. Why not have the nexus point of all of this loss and violence, greed, lust, and just sheer human id? Why not have that be the nexus point from which you call upon the Dark Elder forces for a game? All of those approaches, I think, work incredibly well. And last but certainly not least, why not give the players the chance to stage a revolt of some kind? Eventually, they're going to rise in power and privilege, in skill and ability. Why not give them the chance to take their gladiators a la Spartacus and fight back? If you wanted to lean into the horrors of a military campaign and the kind of darkness that falls when you are engaged in long, protracted warfare, this is a perfect stepping stone to take your players into those kinds of concepts and make it still feel natural in terms of your evolution as a game. But let's say that you want to echo the kind of horror movies that involve one terrifying creature, a monster that pursues you with dogged determination, taking out your friends, your allies, and the people you love, and doing it over an exorbitantly long period of time. You don't have to look too far, you just have to talk to the Byzantines. You see, there's one problem if you're the Byzantines, and frankly speaking, it's not the fact that you're sandwiched between the ruins of the Romans on the west and the, atrocious and horrifying things that want to destroy you, like the Parthians in the east. No, in fact, you have to worry about maritime affairs. Now, again, you could be thinking about raiders from Egypt or Sardinia, but no, we're not talking about those. We're in fact just talking about a giant screw-you whale that proceeded to destroy and attack Byzantine shipping for like 50 years. No, that's not a joke. That's not a typo. It turns out that the Byzantines' biggest op wasn't one of their ancient enemies. It was a giant coked-out version of Monstro from Pinocchio. Allow me to introduce you to Peripheros, or Periphios, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Essentially a giant purple whale. Yes, you heard that right. Purple. It was, how would I describe this? First-hand accounts described it as being a wine dark color, kind of like these, admittedly, very attractively shaded satin sheets. Peripheros decided to turn the Byzantine shipping lanes into its own personal playground, and over a period of 50 years, sunk, capsized, and basically just made the lives of the Byzantine elite and traders absolutely freaking miserable. This is, and I say this as somebody with a horrible case of thalassophobia, objectively horrifying. Imagine that you roll up one day and you're like, oh yeah, maybe we'll be just fine, and you wind up getting vibe checked by a whale. That is crazy, crazy work. And oh, by the way, yeah, all attempts to destroy the whale completely and totally failed. The Byzantine Navy tried to go after it. In many cases, some of the emperors attempted to actually bribe, and by bribe, I mean really actually bribe mercenaries to go after it. All of it failed. But again, this thing is a giant coked out version of Grimace fused with a whale, and what's even worse is we're not entirely positive what kind of whale it was. Based on its aggression and attack patterns, it could have been an orca, but based on its size and overall shape, it could have been a sperm whale. We're not entirely positive which means, in some really horrible version of the conjecture zone, it's a new type of whale that we've never seen before, a whale that thrives on spite, creatine, steroids, and the blood of the Byzantines. That's awesome. Also, one more thing, just like those monsters like Frankenstein or, like Jason or Michael Myers or any of those people that, occasionally wind up getting vibe checked by large numbers of angry people, Periphoros's actual reign of terror winds up getting ended when it was too violent by chasing dolphins. Yes, the giant whale decided that ships weren't enough, so it decided to go after some dolphins for sport, something it had been observed to do, and in the process of doing this, wound up beaching itself. And after a period of several hours, when the villagers realized that the whale could not get loose, they arrived with axes, spears, and torches and proceeded to hack the whale into pieces, which is absolutely fantastic, meaning this giant evil train wreck of a creature got decked by an angry mob a la Frankenstein. Isn't history weird? And again, if you're going to turn this particular instance into a game, I am going to once again shill for one of my favorite games, which is Hell Whalers, a wonderful game that combines the sort of atrocious Book of Revelations, Scrimshaw kind of religious horror with all kinds of crazy mechanics. I really particularly enjoy this one, and I enjoy its vibe. However, if you're wanting to turn it into your own type of game, I imagine it's sort of like a fantasy horror version of FTL. Imagine having to staff, stock, and supply a shipping vessel only to go through a giant massive mission, battling pirates, taking care of raiders, actually duking it out on the high seas, and you need to not only win those encounters, but maintain enough supplies, morale, and strength, because at the very end of your giant logistical journey is this gigantic, horrible thing, except spray-painted purple. Yes, history is genuinely, genuinely terrifying. And I have one last one, a bite-sized snippet, if you will, because I've been doing a lot of research on World War I recently. It's something that's sort of come into my mind as I've actually delved back into some Flash games that I used to play as a kid, one of which was a World War I trench fighting game. Weird how that became a Flash game that I was allowed to play as a child, but here we are. And one of the things that pops up is barbed wire. It's very evocative in terms of the ideas of World War I, but reading firsthand accounts of people stuck in the barbed wire, of the tremendous effort that it would take just to extricate somebody from the barbed wire once it was caught, how doctors in some cases had to remove limbs because the barbed wire had dug in too deeply, or how in many cases ambushes and potential offenses were drawn out because they would just capture people in the barbed wire and leave them alive, long enough that they could start screaming and shrieking and begging for help from their friends. It's sort of next level horrificness that I genuinely don't fully think we comprehend when we think of World War I. It's easy to get lost in the mustard gas and the artillery shellings and all of that wonderful stuff, and by wonderful I mean genuinely freaking horrific, but legitimately I'm more terrified about the fact that at several different moments there are seas, literal seas of razor sharp wire that is there to bind, cut, and in some cases consume you, and I think that's just genuinely terrifying. And with that out of the way, let's talk about some horror recommendations. If you want to play some horror games and you are curious about where to start or which ones I recommend, there are some really great ones that I think people genuinely overlook. I will be leaving out some major ones, so things like Dread or 10 Candles, which I think are absolutely spectacular, are not going to be part of this because I think a lot of people know about them. I also, again, have mentioned things like Hell Whalers and Monster of the Week. Those are really good too. However, if you're looking for additional recommendations, could I perhaps interest you in Shadow of the Demon Lord? If you're somebody who, like me, grew up playing 3.5 or likes Pathfinder or just likes an RPG full of more random tables than you can shake a stick at, you are going to like Shadow of the Demon Lord. It imagines a fantasy world in the throes of an apocalypse. You are not going to be able to withstand it. You are not going to be able to save the world. It is you during the final fading twilight of an entire civilization trying to eke out a living, or perhaps maybe stem the tide for only a few days more. But it is a genuinely horrific, dark, and terrifying look at a fantasy world in the throes of its own collapse. It is genuinely terrifying in some great places, and I love it to pieces. Another one that I think is fantastic is Cult Divinity Lost. I like Call of Cthulhu. I think Call of Cthulhu is a good game. For me, Cult Divinity Lost does everything that I like about Call of Cthulhu way better, in my opinion. It brings the kind of eldritch horror that I absolutely love and combines it with a kind of secret tongue-in-cheek sort of world building that you would find in something like John Wick or Eyes Wide Shut, right? The idea is this eldritch, terrifying world lies just beneath the veil, and we are genuinely more close to this than any of us are comfortable with being. And I love that kind of balancing act between the mundane and the genuinely horrific. And another one that I really enjoy, shout out to my friend Jex and their game Bump in the Dark. I love the Forged in the Dark system in general. I think its use of a timer, a clock, is a wonderful little storytelling and gameplay mechanic, and I think Bump in the Dark does this really well. It combines a lot of punk ethos and punk imagery that I find really engaging and really endearing, as well as a healthy dose of things like Stranger Things and some fantasy as well. And just because Jex is a great person, they actually have community copies. If you find yourself in financial hardship, you can score a copy of the game absolutely free, no questions asked, because they're a good human being, and I think that's awesome. And last but certainly not least, could I interest you in a Fear Within, our own rules light system that combines having a literal child fused to a giant monster? It's like Stephen King meets Pokemon. You have to make childlike fears into powers and then build limitations into those powers. I think that's pretty freaking neat, and a lot of people on Kickstarter did too. One more thing actually before we go into the ending. If you're watching this video at the time of this recording, the price for A Fear Within on PDF is $5. I dropped the price significantly for spooky season, and it will remain at that reduced price for about 2 weeks. So if you're interested in giving it a shot, I wanted to reduce the price because it's spooky season, and then we got Thanksgiving vacation coming up, so if you're looking to take home something special, I think that's a pretty great way to do it. In the meantime, though, if you really like the work that we do here at Desks and Dorks, you want to support us, you want to help us out, our Patreon, $10 a month, you get your own unique role-playing game. You can't get it anywhere else. If you want to buy physical copies of our games, you can get them at Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and I just talked about it, but if you want our digital copies, they're over on itch.io. The link in the description will take you there. So will this QR code on the screen. But with that out of the way, I have to thank the people who help me keep the lights on, so a massive thanks to our patrons, Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Kavadi, Alex.vksh, Solution, Stefan Brosseau, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mare, Darth, Arcane Bard, Commander Unidentified, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Carl Aegis, David Z, Michael Torres, Talath, and a massive thank you to our YouTube members, Ro.kn, Gaming Gambison, Agile Monk, Joshua Williams, Green, Artemis, Marcus Miller, Samuel Putnam, Lorenzo Buck, Seralder, Chandler Dwyer, Sir Goldschmidt, Jakob, Marcus Miller, Krebo, and Teddy Twit. You are all absolutely fantastic. And you folks at home, thank you so much for watching, if indeed you still are. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You all have been absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.